This revision video is for the poem Dulce, Decorum by Wilfred Owen. These are your question stems for poetry. We have part A, where it says read the poem below. In this poem, and it will tell you the name of the poet, explores the ideas about, and it will finish that sentence with a theme. Write about the way that the poet explores the theme given in this poem. And that is your part A question. For part B, it says choose one other poem from the anthology in which the poet also writes about the theme. Compare the presentation of the theme in your chosen poem to the presentation of the same theme in the poem named in part A. And that is part B for your poetry exam. Now, Wilfred Owen was a war poet. He lived between 1893 to 1918, and he had personal experience with shell shock in 1917 during the First World War. And unfortunately, he died in action. Now, the poet himself is one of the most famous war poets. He is synonymous with war poetry. As we've said, he was born in 1993, and died in 1918, just 1 week from the end of the First World War. And in fact, unfortunately, his mother received news of his death on the day that the war was declared over, on Armistice Day. Now, his poetry is characterised by powerful descriptions of the conditions faced by soldiers in the trenches that he experienced firsthand. World War I took place between 1914 and 1918 and is remembered particularly for the use of trench warfare and the use of gas. Now, we see this reflected in the poem through the quotation, "Gas, gas, quick boys." Owing to the technological innovations used during it, the war is often referred to as the first modern war. Now, the sense of terror and panic shown by the use of exclamation marks on this line is a reflection of those technological innovations, the fact that the soldiers were unused to the use of war during the trench warfare, unused to the use of gas, in the trench warfare. Poets such as Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon have a strong association with World War I, as they were both present during the war. As a group, their poetry is often violent and realistic, challenging earlier poetry which communicated a pro-war message. The first-hand experience of war is arguably one reason why there is such a change in attitudes of poets towards war. There was a more realistic viewpoint on the poetry during the First World War than the poetry that came before it, which often glorified war as something noble and honourable to participate in. Now, here you can see your SMILE diagram, or miles, depending on what you have been taught so far. We can see that we analyse using structure, meaning, imagery, language, and effect. Now, your structure is how the poem is set out on the page, the different stanzas and the line lengths, and any repetition, and the effect that that has. The meaning, what is the poem about? Imagery, what imagery is created and how has language been used to create it, and the effect it has on you as a reader. Now, we can see the structure of this poem as not having a clearly defined structure, although Owen does make use of rhyme mostly on alternate line endings. The poem opens with a description of trench life and the conditions faced by soldiers. It has a very slow pace to it in the initial stanza, showing the exhaustion and fatigue that the soldiers were going through. Then comes the gas attack, and the poem offers a graphic description of the lasting effects of such an attack. And here we have our first quotation. "And towards our distant rest began to trudge." So we've got the verb phrase, trudge, to highlight the fact that they are not moving easily throughout this experience. They marched asleep, which reflects their exhaustion during the process of moving during the war. Many had lost their boots. So we can see there the harsh conditions that these soldiers were facing. They are far away from their rest. They are struggling due to the exhaustion that they're feeling and the fatigue, and they are sometimes not even properly equipped. And these are conditions that Owen would have witnessed firsthand. The opening stanza is characterised by the language about fatigue. The soldiers march to sleep, they trudge and they limped on. They are deaf, lame and blind. Now, this pitiful language was intended to reveal the reality of war and its effects, breaking away from the stigma of the pro-war poetry that came before the First World War. And then the pace of the poem changes with this tone of urgency. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling. We see the repetition, which highlights the panic that the soldiers felt in the face of this gas taking place. The urgency through the use of the phrase quick, to highlight how urgent it is that they need to get away from this deadly gas, and an ecstasy of fumbling. Now, fumbling is a verb which reflects how panic-stricken they were in the face of the gas. They were unsure of what they were doing. They were quickly moving to put on their gas masks to try and protect themselves. And this increases the pace of the poem and changes the tone to reflect the panic of the situation. So the speaker describes a vision in a dream of a gas victim guttering, choking and drowning. The listed violent verbs are associated with a lack of air and death, and unfortunately the rest of this poem goes on to detail the suffering death that that soldier experienced. And that is a pivotal point in our poem to understand the harsh realities of war. That two-line stanza is a pivotal changing point in this poem. Now, the language used in the sections depicting the gas attack is strong, representing both the anguish of the victims of the gas attack as well as the effect on those haunted by what they have seen. And we have the quotation there, "Watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face." And where we have the repetition of the word face, it makes it clear which element disturbs the speaker most. The transformation in the face of the victim and his eyes rolling back into his head as he suffers the effects of the gas. The use of the alliteration on the W sound reflects the agonised twisting and twitching of the gas victim as he was so ungainly thrown into the back of the wagon. And then we see the lasting effects of the gas attack. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. So they are described as corrupted. And we have the verbal phrase, come gargling. To show the horrific nature in which this man suffered his death. It was not a gentle death, it was not a quick death. He had a long, suffering death, and this imagery haunts the speaker of the poem. Now, Owen's own disillusionment with war is also clear from the closing lines of the poem. After describing the horrifying effects of the gas attack, he addresses the reader. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. And it's very important he focus on this concept of it being a lie. He saw it as not the truth in which the propaganda and the papers were trying to show to the children that were desperate for glory, but as actually something horrific and dangerous that the soldiers were going through. So he was rejecting the accepted attitude back at home that serving your country in war was glorious. He is critical of the high zest or great enthusiasm used to convince men to go to war. He sees war as brutal and wasteful of young lives. His choice of the noun children is also significant. Impressionable young men are almost lured to war by the promise of desperate glory. And as you can see here, the translation of the old lie from Latin, Dulce, Decorum est, pro patria amore, translates to, it is sweet and fitting to die for your country. So the concept of dying for your country becomes a lie, a long, old, established lie, that it is a good thing to die for your country, whereas Owen knew it not to be. Now we have several different imagery examples within the poem. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, is a simile. It refers to the concept of the soldiers being like old men, begging underneath the weight of their equipment. Furthermore, it's described as a metaphor, men march to sleep. They're so exhausted, it is like they are automatically marching in as they sleep and walk. And then we have this hyperbole phrase, in all my dreams before my helpless sight. So he describes the concept of being utterly helpless before the sight in front of him. There is nothing that he can do. And the poem concludes on a simile, obscene as cancer. Something so horrific nowadays was particularly even worse back then when there was no treatment. So something that was obscene as cancer was what these men were going through every single day. The main themes in the poem are war, death, loss and memories. So keep that in mind when you are linking it to other poems, possibly for your Part B response. And other potential links to the poems are the other war poetry, The Soldier, Mamet's Wood, The Manhunt and A Wife in London. Keep those in mind for your Part B question. Good luck, Year 11.